Hi, everybody. Mark Graben here. Welcome to episode 365 of the podcast. We're joined today also by video with a good friend of mine, a friend of the blog, a previous podcast guest, Dan Markovitz. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast again. It's nice to have a little extra contact during this the COVID isolation phase.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm glad we can talk. And our I don't want to say excuse, but our reason for talking, we talk all the time, we just don't record it. But our reason for getting together and recording a conversation today is to talk about your new book. Tell the listeners what it is, and we'll dive into that.
Sure. So the new book is called The Conclusion Trap, and I'm in the midst of getting it set up on Amazon even as we speak. I think it should be available for purchase in a couple of weeks, but we'll have more clear dates in a little bit. And it's really it's about how to avoid jumping to conclusions or jumping to solutions. My goal was to help people not to solve any problems, but rather how to think about a problem so then they can make a more intelligent, more effective way approach towards actually solving the problems that they're grappling with. And this could either be an organizational problem or it could be a personal problem. Either way, I think that we have a tendency to jump to conclusions. And my goal was to help people slow down.
So tell us about the before we dive more into why people jump to conclusions or why people don't want to spend enough time on problem statements. Who's the intended audience for the book? Is this written for fellow lean geeks or?
That's a good question. I actually am hoping to not preach to the choir of fellow lean geeks. You know, we've come out of, in the lean environment, we've either read Understanding A3 Thinking or Managing to Learn. People have had a great deal of exposure to A3s. And let's face it, A3s, while they're incredibly powerful and worthwhile, many organizations use them, they're actually pretty intimidating for people that are not well versed in and steeped in the lean community. And I mean, I've seen this personally. When you unroll an A3 and show it to people, and here's this big thing, whether it's typed out, which most people do in 4-point font, or even if they handwrite it, it's kind of overwhelming. And when you try to introduce an A3 to people who are, again, well versed with lean, I think that they kind of run away from it. So what I wanted to do was talk to the non-lean community and give them a better sense of how to approach problems without getting bogged down in the whole A3 business and what all the specific boxes are. Mm-hmm. To people in the lean community, this book is basically all about the left side of the A3. But for people that are not in the lean community, this is just about how can we short circuit or prevent ourselves from jumping to solutions that are most likely going to be inadequate, ineffective, and perhaps even detrimental.
Yeah. And I, of course, mean no offense to lean geeks. I have a T-shirt that says lean geek. Dan, you can decide if you want to bear that mantle of
well, you're an engineer, so by definition, you already have the second half, even if not the first.
Fair enough. Just a geek, but different kinds of geek. But to our listeners, I mean, this may be a book. Like when I read it, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, this makes sense. This resonates with me. I like the way you're articulating this. For some people, this might be a book that they give to their boss or to an executive. Maybe they're trying to ease into this type of thinking.
Yeah, I could see this. I could either see individuals using this, or I could see people easily giving it to a boss or a manager or a supervisor to say, hey, what if we try doing something like this? Because there's no forms to fill out. Again, there's no big A3s, anything that might be intimidating. There's no lean jargon at all. And I think that the way I've written it, it's very short. The book is about 60 pages. And that's including pictures, pictures and graphics. And I intentionally wanted to be short because I wanted people to be able to read this, not on an airplane flight, but I wanted them to be able to read it over lunch, something really simple so that anyone would look at it. Instead of putting it on the shelf, they might say, yeah, I'm on the train for a half hour going home. I could totally read this and see if there's anything to learn. And I have to say I was inspired a little bit by some of by Seth Godin's books.
Mhm.
This book is very different. One, it's shorter than anything I've written. Again, it's about 60 pages on a 5x8 book or 5x7.
Mhm.
And it's written in a much more conversational style than
Right.
anything I've written. And I realized, Seth has sold millions and millions of books. He probably knows something about writing,
Mhm.
and maybe I could stand to steal a page from his playbook,
Yeah.
um, and present ideas that are powerful, but in a way that's simple and accessible. Just an easy on ramp to the notion of problem solving, in a new way for most people.
So, in the book, you talk about, some examples, and maybe you can share a few, whether they're from the book or other examples, or we can brainstorm together. You said in the book, when you don't understand the real problem and you're jumping to conclusions, you tend to reach for one of three solutions: one, shiny new technology; two, reorganizing; or three, spending money. Tell us
Yeah.
more about that.
Well, this comes from either conversations I've had with people or painfully from personal experience. In terms of shiny new technology, and this was really the genesis of the book. It was a story told by Rich Sheridan, who you know from Menlo Innovations.
Yep.
He told me about a client or potential client that wanted an iPhone app. And Rich said, well, I understand you want an iPhone app, but the way we do it here at Menlo is I send my high-tech anthropologists out to understand what the real problem is and what the users need, and then we can start doing it. And he did that. And he found that the problem that the guy was facing had nothing to do with technology. It had to do with the bonus system. And
Mm,
no amount of technology would have solved anything. And when Rich told him that, the guy said, yeah, but I really want an app because an app is new and it'll fix stuff.
right.
And of course, it didn't at all. The reorganization comes from something that I've lived through twice, maybe three times. And that is, and we've seen this all the time, that companies say, well, sales are down, so we're going to reorganize. We're going to change the way, whether maybe we go from a business unit structure to a matrix structure. Maybe we go from matrix to shared services. I mean, there's all kinds of things people change. And the business card manufacturers, the printers, do really good because everyone changes their title. But the truth is, customers don't really care how you're organized. You could be in functional silos, or you could be organized in value streams, and there are obviously pros and cons to both. The customer doesn't care. Are you providing the right product at the right price at the right time? It doesn't matter how you're organized, as long as you can do it. Wonderful. And then the spending the money. This is something we've all seen, and I think for me it was most impactful. A story that Kevin, our mutual friend Kevin Meyer over
Mhm.
at Gimble Academy, told
Mhm.
me once back in the day when he had a real job and he wasn't working at Gimble Academy. He was working for a company in the biomedical device
Mhm.
space,
Right.
and he was trying to. This is actually his introduction to lean. His factory was far, far, far behind on orders for its customers, and the company decided to spend $2 million on more, I think it was injection molding machines, perhaps. I'd have to look at the book and see what it was.
Right.
And it turns out that they didn't actually need more machines at all. It had to do with maintenance and fast changeovers and things like that.
Right.
And Kevin, hats off to him. He went to see Doc Hall, and he learned everything he could about lean and rapid changeover, and he embedded himself with the AME. And by the time the machines came in, about 8 or 9 months later, they'd spent $2 million. And he's like, I don't need these machines. I'm doing just fine. We're all caught up.
Right.
And I'm sure your time back in the day at GM, you saw similar things where people were buying new machines or spending money on all kinds of stuff.
Oh, in healthcare.
Oh
So
yeah,
I'll share an example. But first, I was going to say, yeah, Rich Sheridan. He was on episode 189 of the podcast. If people want to go listen to him, we were talking about his book Joy Inc. And I should try to talk to him about his more recent book, as it's been a while. So you
Joy
can go to
Inc. is a
Lean.
fantastic book for sure. Really
Fantastic guy.
inspirational.
It's I
Yeah,
had a chance to visit Menlo Innovations in Ann Arbor once. So you can tell it's a special kind of place.
it really is. It really is. I mean, you see that, and it's although Rich, I think, hates it when people say he's sort of a model place to visit because it's so wonderful. All he sees are the flaws, and everyone goes there and they're just awestruck by the kind of leadership and visual management and
Teamwork.
collaboration. It's insane.
Yeah. So I encourage people to go check that out, leanblog.org/189. But yeah, I mean, what I've seen in healthcare over 15 years, and this is how I've articulated it, like the three solutions that people tend to jump to are more money, more space, more people. So more money might be we need more equipment,
Right.
but more. And the one example that comes to mind a lot, like when I first started working in healthcare, it was in a lot of hospital laboratories. And the one solution that a lot of organizations had chosen was something called it was an automated track system. So instead of individual analyzers that you would load tubes of blood into, they would all be put onto this giant, basically conveyor belt system, and you would just load all of the tubes in one loading zone,
Uh-huh.
and they would all creep down conveyor belts and get kicked into the correct machine or into a centrifuge if
So there's
needed.
an assembly line of test tubes running and machines running assays. Yeah.
Yeah, in a very automated way.
Right.
And so the argument sometimes for, well, we need the track system is, well, somehow this is going to help reduce turnaround times. The turnaround time problem of why the percentage of value added was very low was not due to a lack of automation. It was due to batching in specimen
Mhm.
collection and batching and pre-analytical processes. And so people would put in this track system. And yes, I am that kind of engineer. I'm a stopwatch geek. You stopwatch a tube of blood, and it's creeping down this conveyor much slower than a person could have just walked it, right? So you spend millions of dollars on this track system that ends up slowing down a lot of your turnaround time. There would be maybe a claim of labor savings, but the core problem around turnaround time was then often solved by ripping out the track system and putting the
Oh,
machines into what we might call a lean cell. And the idea of paying someone to carry a small batch of tubes is not the worst thing in the world compared to this millions of dollar capital expenditure. So I mean
oh
that's a
yeah.
solution that had been popular for a while.
Right.
We jump to a conclusion that someone else has already come to, and maybe there's some groupthink in an industry, and an idea spreads whether it should or not.
That reminds me of a story. Actually, at Martin Memorial Health System down in Florida, it was documented by, I can't remember who wrote it up. Maybe John Toussaint might have been involved, but it was published. They were going to spend $300,000 on ventilators because they never had, the hospital, the nurses never had enough ventilators. This is long before COVID-19, obviously, but they were out of it. They didn't have enough ventilators. But before they spent the money, they had a team of internal folks who were understood lean. They said, before we spend the 300 grand, let's try to understand what's actually happening. What they found was, at first, they actually were had a slightly higher ventilator to patient ratio than most hospitals of comparable size, just a little bit higher. And of course, the shortage wasn't caused by a lack of ventilators. It was that no one could find the ventilators.
Yeah.
So nurses were stashing them in hallways, in closets, in stairwells, just to make sure they had their ventilator when they needed it.
Right.
And so it wasn't a lot. The problem was framed, of course, as the problem is a lack of ventilators. The problem wasn't the lack of ventilators. The problem was we don't have a way of actually ensuring that the ventilator, once it's done being used by the patient, gets to a central place where people can get it. But to your point, the initial response is, oh, well, you buy more ventilators, you put in a multi-million-dollar test tube assembly conveyor machine, because that's clearly the way to do it. On a small level, I worked with a company years ago. My background, of course, is in the sporting goods and outdoor business. And the customer service folks were really struggling because it was taking the company a week to turn around customer chargebacks. So, for example, if there's a defective product, or if you ship something wrong, the customer calls you up and says, maybe it's Dick's Sporting Goods, says, "Hey, listen, you owe me $50 or $100, whatever." It would take them about a week to process the refund. And the head of the customer service department said, "Well, we do this all manually. The customer service guy writes down on a piece of paper, he brings it over to me, and it would be so much easier if it was all done electronically, if we could tie it into Oracle or SAP or whatever they were using." And at first blush, it sounded like it makes sense. Well, sure, if we could automate it instead of paper forms, walking it from desk to desk, that'd be great. But when we looked at the process, and this is to your point about how long it takes to a conveyor belt to move an assembly, a test tube versus a human being, the delay wasn't in the writing out the filling out the piece of paper or approving it. The paper sat in the manager's inbox for somewhere between 3 and 5 days.
Right.
Just sat there. He didn't do anything. And, he had a lot of things coming in, but he didn't have a special inbox marked, chargebacks, process hourly or process twice a day or whatever. And had they turned it into something that would have been electronic, it would have sat in his email inbox instead of his paper inbox for a week. And they would have been in exactly the same place, but it would have taken him 4 months of custom software customization and Oracle consulting to end up in exactly the same place that they were.
Yeah.
So sure, we could spend money.
So, and you use an example there. I know you did it for a reason. I think we're in agreement here that's saying lack of something is not a good way to frame a problem statement. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is something, of course, you hear a lot. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough money. We lack enough people, whatever it is. We don't have enough space. You never have enough of those things. You never have enough. Even Google doesn't have enough money. Even the largest organization in the world doesn't have enough space or enough people. And I think that it's easy to look at that because it's the simplest way to phrase the problem. We don't have enough of this. But what it means is that you always end up with this first order solution that fails.
Right.
Because of the underlying factors. And I think within managing, I'm not sure if it's in managing to learn, but certainly within the lean community, when we talk about A3s, we do talk about this quite a bit, this idea of saying you don't have enough of something that's really just a clever way of phrasing your solution as the problem.
Right. It's the inverse of the solution. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's certainly one thing to be careful of as we're working with problem statements. I think a way that I found often useful to promote the idea of good problem statements is to talk about open vistas versus cul-de-sacs. And what I mean by that is if your problem statement leads you down one road and only one road towards a solution, you probably have the wrong problem statement. A problem statement should be opening up avenues of exploration. So if you say the problem is we don't have enough we don't have a conveyor system to analyze the blood samples, the only thing you can do is get a conveyor system.
Now, if the problem is framed in terms of turnaround times are too long and it's delaying patient discharge or diagnosis, maybe that's a better problem statement.
Right, because now we could talk about staffing. We could talk about machines and automation. We could talk about the where the lab is physically located compared to the patients. We could talk about how long it takes the nurses or whoever it is bringing the blood samples down. At one hospital actually I worked at, they were having some issues with turnaround time as well. And it turns out that nurses, especially the overnight shift, they take the blood samples, and then maybe they'd stop for a cup of coffee or talk to someone. But the clock for that, the turnaround time starts when you take the blood sample, not when it gets to the lab.
Right.
So, but if you say, well, we have to get faster machines, then all you can do is get faster machines. And so I think the notion of being able to reflect back at your problem statement and say, is this offering me a lot of different avenues to explore? That's kind of a good check to make sure, or to think about whether you're actually on the right track with a good problem statement. Another check that's useful is to go back to the data. So saying we need an automated machine or we don't have an automated machine or our machine breaks down too often is not the data. But to use your example, our turnaround time is 72 minutes and we've promised that would be 60 minutes. Or patients are waiting 50% of the time, or patients are unhappy. Okay, great. Now I've got something that I can work with. I can clarify it. I can measure it. We don't have to measure everything, but to be able to but if you can measure it, then we have something that's concrete. And again, because we're talking about numbers and data, it doesn't push us down the road towards a specific solution.
So you talk about some of this nuance of maybe you don't always need data, or I think I've seen organizations get in trouble where they struggle, where, like you said earlier, the A3 format can be intimidating, and then sometimes I've heard people say, well, that problem solving model seems like overkill in these certain situations. I'm like, well, that might be true. So I'm curious, how would you break down or help identify when is something a quote unquote just do it, or I'd rather say a just PDCA it, or just PDSA it. But when should we have a bias toward just going and testing something, and when do we know when we need to be more rigorous and spend more time on framing the problem?
That's a really good question. The easy answer is to say if the building's on fire, you don't necessarily want to do it, but you don't often see flames. I'm not sure how to answer that, Mark. What do you think? I feel like this might be better for discussion than for me to pompously bloviate on the topic.
Well, we can both bloviate. How's that? So, but you use the example of firefighting, and so one of the silly cartoons that I've had created in collaboration with an artist, I've posted it on Leanblog, is a cartoon about firefighters doing an A3. Have you seen this?
I seem to remember it. Yeah.
But here, since we're doing a video podcast, let me just.
You can actually pull it up.
I can share my screen real quickly.
How exciting!
I apologize to the audio listeners, the audio only listeners, but you can go to leanblog.org/365. And so here's the cartoon. And in the first panel, there's a firefighter. He says, hey, he's saying to another firefighter, help me get this hose started. And then the second firefighter is holding an A3 that says, problem statement, a fire, question mark. And the firefighter, he says, don't jump to solutions. And then the other firefighter, you see the building burning. Oh, right, we're supposed to get consensus on the plan phase first. So that's sort of an exaggerated, silly example. No one's going to start breaking out an A3 when there is a literal fire that has to be contained. But I think sometimes, and again, I'm not discounting the thesis of your book, that we're better served by not jumping to conclusions in a vast majority of cases. But I would propose, and I want to hear what you think, is if there's a relatively small problem that has a relatively obvious and easily testable countermeasure, and you can test that countermeasure, and if it doesn't work, you can click undo, if you will. Like that might be a time to just try it or just PDCA it. But sometimes we think a problem's simple and we just try something and we realize, oh, wow, we don't understand this at all. Let's go back and do an A3. I've seen a lot of scenarios of along those lines.
What you say makes sense. I guess I think in light of that, I would add, well, how urgent is it to solve it right now? So if the building's on fire, literally or metaphorically, you by all means go try something immediately, because you really can't afford to wait. But if it's something that's been a chronic problem over the course of weeks or months, you spend a day or a half a day or 2 days, it's not really going to matter. It has in terms of having a major effect on the company. So I think how long it's been going on and how urgent it seems. And I think we can determine urgency pretty easily. We know it when we see it for sure. I think also there's probably an element of what's the risk or the cost of jumping to a conclusion. If you're jumping to a conclusion and it's a $3 million bet, maybe you want to spend a little time. But if it's jumping to a conclusion, it's 25 cents or $3 or a ream of paper at Staples or something. Right. Well, all right, what the heck? Give it a shot.
So in that lab example, like literally this multi-million-dollar equipment, here's the kicker. I think at some of these hospitals, whoever decided to put in the track system was claiming a positive ROI for putting it in. And then you could also claim a positive ROI for taking it out. Like you shouldn't be able to double dip that way.
That does not seem right. In lean hospitals, you actually wrote about one of these things. It's an example I use in my book about the hospital where patients were complaining about noise in the hallways at night. And so So they put in carpeting everywhere to quiet things because, of course, wheels on linoleum are allowed. It turns out it was really just a matter of having doors open with TVs on very loud.
Yeah.
And if you closed the doors, everything was good. And in the meantime, the supreme irony, as I recall you pointing out, is that the the hospital was really big on promoting the cows, the computers on wheels, and bringing things along with the nurses. But
Right.
with the carpeting, it made it really difficult to do that. So they
Right.
installed the carpeting which cost money and didn't solve the problem, but
Created
fought,
others.
worked against another one of the organizational mandates to start dragging computers along with you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean that was probably somebody jumping to a conclusion, and I think that situation with the carpet was compounded because the person jumping to the conclusion was very disconnected from the frontline work. It was like literally like in the C-suite where that
Yeah.
decision was being made without input from the people who are really there dealing with the situation. So maybe I'll ask you to elaborate on that in terms of, if someone in the organization identifies a problem, how do you decide who are the right people to go and help properly define that problem if when that's needed?
Well, I don't. Obviously, the lean answer is the people closest to the problem. Okay, that's fine. Certainly, we want people there to help define it. But there's nothing wrong with the CEO or the VP or a board member coming in to help define the problem, as long as he or she is willing to actually go to where it's occurring, so that he or she can see himself.
Right.
And I think that's where because let's face it, by and large, if you've made it to the point where you're a board member or you're the CEO or the VP of XY of something, you're probably pretty competent. You're probably pretty smart. You're almost certainly experienced. Um, Not always, of course, and you bring your own biases and blinders with you, but you probably have seen an awful lot of stuff in your day. And so the perspective you can bring, even though you're an outsider, is valuable. The problem is when you're using that perspective in a vacuum. And
Yeah.
so you're working off of, uh, of data, but no facts, and that's a real issue.
Yeah. So I think I know what you mean by that, but can you elaborate on that? Some listeners might be wondering, what do you mean data versus facts?
This is something interesting you asked that, because a friend of mine was really confused about that, and honestly, I was a little confused about that too when I first heard that. So data are numbers. Um, Data is tells you that an employee attrition rate, say, is higher than an industry average. But facts, when you spend the day in the office where people work, show that the office is kind of dark and unpleasant, and there's a smell, and there's no space for quiet reflection. And the company outsourced facility services to, they don't do a good job of cleaning the bathroom. Um, Data can tell you, for example, that customers applying for a mortgage forget to fill out certain parts of forms. And therefore, the bank employees have to follow up, with customers and call them up and say, I need this information. But facts, which is close examination of the form and direct observation of an applicant while filling out the form, shows that the form is really poorly laid out and it's cluttered and it's easy to miss the box. Um, in a factory setting, data tells you how often a machine breaks down on an assembly line or what the OEE is. But the facts show you that the machine is dirty, it's covered in oil, and it hasn't been cleaned and maintained, which gives you a much different understanding. And to me, data is kind of, without the facts, is kind of anemic. It's two dimensional. It's literally and metaphorically a black and white view of the world.
Hmm.
Facts without the data gives you color and texture, right? But it doesn't give you the detailed insight that you're going to need to solve the really complicated problems, because you do need the data.
Yeah.
So you need both to marry both the facts and the data, bring them together so that you get a holistic understanding of what's actually happening. And I think that is the first road. That's the road, or the first step down the road towards coming up with a really understanding the problem.
Yeah.
And then eventually coming up with solutions or countermeasures that can effectively address that problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another thing that comes to mind is that, data can be inaccurate for one reason or another.
It's a
Measurement
really good
error,
point.
distortion of the data, intentional or otherwise, where facts are hopefully indisputable. true or not
Yeah.
true, right?
That's a good point. I actually didn't think about the distortions of the data or just the poor measurement, or there's all kinds of issues that can make data somewhat less than 100% reliable. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You look at the data and you might miss something really important. You turned me on to bar rescue.
Yeah,
um,
John
and
Taffer.
there are these episodes. I mean, leaving aside the cheesy aspect of it in a
There's a
lot
lot
of
of
ways,
yelling and drama. Yeah,
there's a lot of drama and yelling, but the notion of the data says that the bar sales are down, or that beer that there's what do you call shrinkage of inventory or whatever. Um, the facts reveal that the manager is out there comping the cute women all the time with drinks. This is from season 2, by the way. Swanky Bubbles was the episode. Um,
yeah,
and he's comping women drinks all the time, which one does it. Therefore, they generally don't tip on it. So everyone is angry that their tips are being cut down. And he messes up the order of drinks coming into the bar, and they have real problems keeping up with demand. Um, and we're not even talking about the facts of the dirty fryer and things like the various health issues. But you get to see the texture of things in a way that you don't with just facts. The fact that the bar in that particular one, for example, in Swanky Bubbles, was so narrow that the bartenders couldn't pass each other from one side to the other. And it made it nearly impossible to restock the bar, or to
yeah,
serve customers the way they needed to. But you wouldn't get that just by looking at the facts. The data shows you that this is alcohol sales, this is the profit margin, and something's wrong. Well, fire the bartenders, I guess.
yeah.
No, that's not necessarily the problem. Although it being a reality show, that was part of the problem.
Yeah.
Part of the problem.
Yeah. So you've got a manager giving away drinks. We'll leave a rhetorical question. What problem was he trying to solve? We can leave that to, we shouldn't
Right.
speculate. Um, but, so, yeah, Bar Rescue is interesting because I haven't watched it in a while, but John Taffer, he doesn't just come in with solutions. Like the show is a little bit in the mode of John Taffer is the expert, and he and his team will come up with a new name, a new concept, a new decor, a new menu, new training. Like it's very much the expert comes in and solves it. So so he says he goes by data. He looks at market that they're in and competitors and demographics. And in early seasons, they talk a lot about bar science. But, I wonder how much is he jumping to a conclusion, or there's this trap, maybe part of back to the title of your book, The Conclusion Trap. When John Taffer, even if he has the correct conclusions, the bar owners often revert back to what they had before, even though that business was failing.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see.
I think that in Bar Rescue, when you see the real shortcomings of the expert coming in and solving the problems, as opposed to enabling the people who are in the front line to come up with their own solutions or countermeasures, because they don't own it, they're not invested. You've written about this many times. They are compliant, but they're not committed.
Right.
Some of the changes he makes, of course, are it's taking advantage of his experience. For example, where's the TV in the bar, and what are they looking at, and how far away are they from the bar, and things like that. Which there's probably some really good rules of thumb of people should be looking this way and not that way, or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
But again, he makes those physical changes when the guys come in with their sledgehammers and redecorate the bar. But getting the commitment is really hard to saying we're going to act differently. The manager's going to be there, and he'll in one of the episodes, the manager tend to sort of lose focus, and the owner would just sort of sit in a chair instead of making sure that the Heineken keg was refilled, or that things were being brought out of the cooler, or whatever needed to be done. He would just lose focus.
Yeah. And then, kind of thinking back to the type of work that you and I do, whether we're calling it A3 problem solving or just going through a methodology like you describe of having a way of spending more time on a problem statement and creating a good problem statement. Do you ever find, or can you think of situations or why clients might sometimes get impatient and say, well, wait, this is going to take too long. You're guiding me through the process. You've done this before. Why don't you just tell us what the answer is?
Yeah, you see this. I see this quite a bit, and especially since, in general, although I don't work this way, in general, a lot of clients are used to buying consulting services by the hour, sort of like a plumber.
Mm-hmm.
I always work on the project fee, irrespective of how long it takes, so that takes some of the pressure off.
Yeah.
But for sure, I always say to them, look, it's teaching a person to fish. You want to fish, or do you want to learn to fish? It seems to me that the last thing you want to do is spend a crap ton of money with me, having me come in all the time. And sure, we can fix it, but that's not going to fix it tomorrow. And tomorrow there's going to be something else. And so it seems like it's really worth the time to try to have you figure it out yourself. Now, to be fair, I think I'm not as good as some people like Dave Verbal or Katie Anderson, or probably you, in terms of asking questions. I tend to maybe talk more than I should and ask fewer questions, or give more directions and ask fewer questions than I would like. But I do try to move them towards that. And I think usually they're respectful of the intent, especially since there's no meter running. That, again, that really obviates the problem and makes them trust me, because as long as they're not paying the extra to be there for a full day instead of 2 hours,
Right.
What do they care?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a balance, right? I think there's a time and a place, like you were saying earlier. If it's a really urgent problem, maybe we need to have more of a bias for action, even if it's not the best long-term solution. Let's do something now, and then come back. We'll do the root cause analysis on what caused the fire after the fire has been put out. That can wait, and we've got to remember to follow up on that, and not just be done when we've put the fire away. And I also think there's a balance and a time and a place for coaching by asking questions. Like there's Edgar Schein's humble inquiry approach. Well, if you overuse that can really annoy clients or people you're working with. I think there's a time and a place for making a well-placed suggestion in a way that's not taking ownership of the problem away from people. Like what I've learned from certain approaches to counseling is, if someone asks you, well, hey, just tell me, what do you think we should do? You can answer that in a way that says, well, let me tell you about something that worked in one situation. Now you're not assuming it's transferable. And you might share the situation and then follow it up asking, well, what do you think about that?
Yeah.
So don't let someone pawn off or outsource the problem to you, is what I would recommend as a coach or as a consultant.
Yeah, and it does very much depend on what your role is supposed to be. I used to be a high school cross country coach. So coach is in the title, but we would have gotten nowhere if I said, hey, what do you guys think you should run today? Or why are you thinking you should do a 5-miler today instead of an 8-miler? The kids were relying upon my experience and knowledge as a former competitive runner and as a coach to say, this is the structure, this is today's workout, and this is this week's, and this is how we're going to work the season. And of course, they could always ask questions and try to understand why we're doing it in a certain way. But to ask them for their opinions on it would have been pointless. We never would have gotten anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably an analog to that in certain business cases. Back to Bar Rescue. Sorry, again, I remember the one episode where he said your TVs are all in the wrong place. He could have said, "Well, why do you have your TVs here? What were you thinking?" But it's far better to, I think, in something like that. It's easier for Jake Tapper, whatever his name was, to say,
John Taffer.
Hey, listen, Taffer. Yeah. Hey, here's where the TV should go. You always want them here because what it does is increase people looking at each other and communication, more socialization, and therefore people, when they talk and they socialize, they drink more. Great.
Right.
So I'm going to solve the problem for you.
Yeah. And so, do you define the problem in terms of the problem is the TVs are in the wrong place, or the problem might be something deeper I don't know, the scenario, but I'm trying to think of an example. Or I think of one episode, maybe it was Swanky Bubbles, or the problem is the bar stools have backs on them. Like, well, that's true. Well, no, maybe the problem is that the bar stools are too big and people
Right.
can't get through and people can't interact. If I remember right, that's a solution that John Taffer tended to come back to, is like, oh, you need stools without backs.
Right.
Maybe it depended on the bar. If it was really crowded, some people might say, oh, but it's not as comfortable. I guess it depends on the situation, right? So maybe that's where you would come back and say, well, here's something that worked for another bar. How do you think that would work here? But John Taffer really says, no, here's what you need to do.
Right. And as I recall, his big issue with this stools without backs is that if they're bigger, you get one fewer seat at the bar,
Mm-hmm.
which could be a problem. On the other hand, if the seats are more comfortable, people might stay longer and have another drink. So maybe you could skin the cat another way. You could say, okay, I'm going to increase the price of my drinks by $1, which people might not notice, and they're going to be more comfortable. So it's okay. Overall, I'm going to end up with a wash in terms of revenue and profit, because even though I've got fewer seats.
Yeah.
So, but John has his solution.
Yeah.
Which is stools with no backs.
And he has certain technology solutions, some of which are sponsors of the show. But like one of the things he installs, if somebody were to say, oh, the problem is a lack of a bottle measuring system. Well, there's a solution where you can put these pourers that have sensors, or however it works. The problem statement might be bartenders are giving away too many free drinks.
Right.
So putting in technology, like this is where I'm skeptical around, like, is it really a technology problem, or is it something related to the culture of the organization? Like I think of, do you know Paul Levy, who used to be CEO at Beth Israel Deaconess?
Beth Israel Deaconess, right? Yeah.
So I remember one thing in when he was blogging as a hospital CEO, sometimes people would frame the problem as, quote unquote, nurses are screwing around on Facebook too much. So the solution that's commonly posed is, well, we're going to just block access to Facebook.
Right.
Well, then Paul realized, and when he was blogging about this, iPhones were becoming popular. He's like, you can block it on the corporate network, but they're going to use, if they're going to use Facebook, they're going to use cellular data, and they're going to do it on their phone. So that solution doesn't really solve anything. You've got to step back and dig into it and ask, why
are they spending time on Facebook?
Why are they disengaged? And I'm not blaming them for being disengaged, but like that sounds like the type of thing where it requires some deeper problem solving, like you would talk about in your book.
And I think I would step back and say, not so much deeper problem solving, better problem framing.
Fair enough.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it depends. If you say our nurses spend time on Facebook they shouldn't be spending, or something like that, that's not the most artful way of putting it. Right. Well, now there's all kinds of possible countermeasures. You could block it. You could find out why they're spending time on Facebook. Maybe we rephrase it to say nurses are not engaged, or nurses are so stressed at work. The work environment is so stressful they have to unplug and spend time on Facebook. That leads to you down an entirely different road than saying nurses have easy access to Facebook.
Yeah.
Or we have to stop nurses from having access to Facebook, something like that.
Right.
It's an entirely different direction, and it's a different understanding of the problem. And I think, we see this with all the time in the Wall Street Journal and every other newspaper with just in time, right?
But they're blaming just in time for...
Right. The problem is that just in time we ran out because of just in time. That's actually a solution or an answer. But really what we want to be saying is, how do we make our just in time systems aren't as resilient as we want, or our just in time systems can't, supply chains can't handle black swan events. Okay, that leads you to all kinds of different possibilities.
Yeah. So what we're looking at now, or recently, or when this is published, still probably going on. The pandemic. If Nassim Taleb, if I'm saying his name.
Yeah, right. The black swan guy.
He's the one who coined the phrase black swan. I saw an interview where he said very clearly, this pandemic is not a black swan. It is a white swan. We could have and should have predicted this, and that there's no excuse for not being prepared. Like he says, 9/11 was a black swan, even though there were probably some who warned and predicted. He said this was much more foreseeable and something where then we could step back and say, well, the problem is we don't have enough supplies. So then you could step back and say, well, what was our plan for addressing this eventual likelihood? Not if we're going to have a pandemic, but when. So you could blame just in time. You could frame it as when we need to order more of something, our supply chain isn't responsive enough. Why is the supply chain not responsive enough? A lot of the supply chain is coming from China, and China's been hampered by coronavirus, and it's a really long, slow supply chain, even in the best of times. It's interesting how people lock in on a cause, or maybe likewise they lock in on a solution when they're going through what we might call problem solving or problem definition. I was just going to say one other thing. I really liked how you kind of steered it back toward problem definition. Because one other thing I've heard a lot of, people will say like, oh, we don't need problem solving training. We're really good problem solvers. What they really mean is that they are good at jumping to solutions. They're not good at problem definition. They're not good at evaluating and closing the loop. There's a lot of do. There's very little plan. And there's often no study and adjust.
There's I don't know if you saw this in the news, but as a result of the unemployment both here and all over the world with COVID-19, Denmark apparently has taken a very different approach towards dealing with folks. They're paying money to companies. They're telling companies we will pay something like 80% or 90% of employee salaries. Just keep them on the payroll, 80, 90%. So what we've done, of course, is we've pumped a ton of money into the unemployment offices, right? So when you think about it, to me, there's an implicit framing of the problem, which is in the United States, we say, how do we help laid off workers? Or our laid off workers need a lot of help. So the framing is that our workers are laid off. In Denmark, again, not that I've spoken to anyone there, but it would seem implicit that what they have done is say, how do we keep companies from laying people off?
Right.
It's a very different approach.
The one problem is framed as people have lost their jobs, therefore they need money, as opposed to framing it as companies can't make payroll. How do we solve that? Now, in the US, there's the CARES Act that's been passed, and companies are now applying for the PPP program, the payroll protection plan. I have no idea when those payments are going to start coming out, but people had to pay rent or their mortgage on April 1st.
Right.
Companies had rents due. There are immediate real-term needs that I don't know when some of these solutions will actually kick in, but it's a different podcast, maybe.
I have to say, one of the truly surprising things, and I am by no means any sort of expert in government bureaucracies and the way that macroeconomics work and the economy is put together. But I keep thinking, we're now, with the CARES Act, part of it is giving people $1,200 or whatever it is, and people have to apply through their unemployment offices. And it seems to me that there are, whatever the number is, 100-something million workers. There are far fewer companies. It seems like it'd be just a lot easier to say to the companies, here's your money. Now pay these people. Obviously, there needs to be some sort of oversight to make sure they're not just scamming the government and the taxpayer.
Right.
But there are fewer companies to deal with. You wouldn't have the same kind of 3-hour waits on the telephone with the unemployment office because it's easier to reach the number of companies than it is to reach the number of people.
Right. So it seems like we're trying to address the problem from two sides. And so through the unemployment system, which has been expanded to include people who are independent contractors,
right,
gig economy people who traditionally wouldn't have been eligible, and then also addressing it through the IRS, which I think is sending out incentive stimulus payments to individuals, and then there's some of these payments the emergency loan payment, and then the PPP loans have to go through the bank. Like, it's all very complex. So I don't know if it's an
Really complex.
elegant solution. Maybe Denmark is onto something. Does that seem like a more elegant solution with less complexity?
It seems that way to me, but who knows how the Danish economic system is put together. There was another, I saw this again, another issue about problem framing. It was in the Wall Street Journal 10 days ago, 8 days ago, something like that. The guy who was writing, it was an op-ed column. He has a kid at school in the Berkeley public school system. And the public schools have essentially, they haven't provided really any robust online at-home learning. And the reason is, according to him, that as he spoke to the supervisor, she said, we know that there are poor people in the community who don't have internet access. There are all these existing inequalities and inequities, and we don't want to exacerbate it by saying, okay, all you rich folks who have computer access, you're going to get all this stuff, and the other kids no. So instead, we're just going to say, listen, there's some, I don't know, TV show they can watch for half an hour a day or something like that. And to me, again, this is a problem of framing. The Berkeley school system is saying, we don't want our at-home learning to disadvantage poor students, which sounds okay.
Yeah.
But it pushes you towards a solution of going to the lowest common denominator, which means not allowing the wealthier students with better access to move faster, to learn more. But what would happen if they said, we need to eliminate at-home learning? What would happen if you took the hotels that are empty and you put all the kids in the hotels? What would happen if you ask Google, and again, who knows whether this would work or not, hey, Google, can you provide tablets, Chromebooks to everyone? Or could you talk to AT&T and say, hey, AT&T, for the next 2 months, for the rest of the school term, would you provide free cell service to all these people? Most of them have phones. Maybe they could do enough of work just with their phones. They don't even need any new hardware. What would happen if they provided that? So what we're doing is reducing the at-home learning or making it free, as opposed to saying, well, we need to eliminate the disadvantage.
Yeah.
It changes the focus of the problem, I think, or and therefore the countermeasures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so it's a lot to think about and chew on there, but yeah, I mean, this whole idea of problem framing, problem definition, really powerful notions, and I'm glad that you've written the book here. Again, it's The Conclusion Trap. The paperback is available for ordering when we recorded this on April 10th, and the Kindle version may be available for pre-order or purchase by the time this is published. So I guess we just encourage people. What would you recommend? They can go look on Amazon. They can go look on your website, which is
they can go to my website. I'll have a link there. I've set up a website for the book that has downloads called theconclusiontrap.com. Makes sense. And
markovitzconsulting.com.
markovitzconsulting.com, theconclusiontrap.com. I'll have links for those things. And again, it'll be available on Amazon, and then I'll probably be making it available at all your other online book places as well. But I have to sort of work my way through how to make that happen. Or more correctly, I'll have to ask you how to make that happen, Mark, since you're my Sherpa in online publishing.
Happy to help. And if I'm ever jumping to conclusions, make sure you call me on that. Okay.
You betcha. I'll try to remember.
Keep me honest. So,
well, thank you, Mark, for having me. This was just it was so much fun getting to talk to you and doing another podcast. It's been a long time, and it's always a pleasure to talk about these things with you.
Yeah, I'm glad we could do it. Again, if people want links to the book and Dan's previous appearances here on the podcast, you can go to leanblog.org/365. Let's see. Dan was a guest at least on episodes 52, 135, 244. We talked about, 2008.
Holy moly. Ugh,
The first one we
I feel
did.
old.
We talked about your book, A Factory of One, in 20.
I think I had more hair back then, yeah?
Yes, I do remember when I see these old pictures. And then we did a podcast, episode 224, on your book, Building the Fit Organization.
Got it.
Invite people to go check those out as well. So Dan, thanks a lot as always, and good luck with the book launch.
Pleasure is mine. Thanks again, Mark, and stay safe.
You too.